We're going to get started on time. Good afternoon, everyone. Ed. Once you sit down, everyone else will sit down. Good afternoon and welcome back from lunch. Next up, we have a really exciting talk on what it takes to move the needle on reimbursement for personalized medicine. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'm Cynthia Benz, and I serve as the Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Personalized Medicine Coalition. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Michael Sherman. Dr. Sherman served for 12 years as Chief Medical Officer of Point32 Health, which was created in 2021 by the merger of Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare and Tufts Health Plan. He's now a venture partner at RA Capital Management. To share a bit of my own personal experience with Dr. Sherman, before joining the PMC, I spent most of my career at a patient advocacy organization. And to most patients, as some of you are in the room, and patient advocacy organizations, for the most part, payers aren't your allies. And I can say pretty confidently that many patients often face the fears that the payers are the people who are going to serve as the greatest roadblock to diagnostics and treatments. So when I joined the PMC, and Ed went through the composition of the board, he mentioned that there was a payer representative on it. And I'll admit I was pretty skeptical that this individual is going to be constructive to conversations that have to do with how you can accelerate the pace of adoption of diagnostics and treatments. And I figured that person was really there for a reality check, and also, when necessary, to pump the brakes on PMC getting too far ahead of itself on issues related to reimbursement and coverage. And then I met Dr. Sherman, and I quickly realized that he's different, and he represents a different type of payer. And right away, I understood why he is widely recognized as a leader in developing and implementing strategies that facilitate access to innovative technologies and a proponent of generating real-world evidence to demonstrate the value that these technologies carry. And that mantle has been taken up and was carried on behind the scenes by Dawn Cordero at Point32 Health, who now sits on PMC's board, and we're very lucky to have her. But during Michael's time as a payer, first with Harvard Pilgrim and then with Point32 Health, he was responsible for driving some novel reimbursement agreements with both diagnostic and drug developers. And some of them that happened pretty soon after I joined the PMC were work that he did to expand the availability of non-invasive prenatal testing for inherited genetic conditions, whole genome sequencing for children with suspected rare diseases to shorten the diagnostic odyssey many families face, comprehensive genomic profiling that informs effective use of cancer treatments, and coverage for gene therapies that were among the first to address rare and pediatric disorders. These are just a few examples of what he's done and what he was able to do with his team, and I'm sure he has a lot more to share on that. It's no secret from the panelists this morning that innovators in personalized medicine are struggling. One struggle is to convince health insurers that paying for more diagnostics and treatments today will decrease health spending in the future by keeping patients healthier longer. We all need some clarity on where to go next and how we can speak the same language, which is something that Dawn brought up in a meeting that we had yesterday. My hope is that Dr. Sherman is not the only payer with enough vision to recognize that the diagnostics and treatments underpinning personalized medicine will not only have a positive impact on the people's lives that they cover today, but that also by providing access and gathering data, that they're really working to create and sustain a more equitable access to care in the future. And to do this, payers need to do more of what Dr. Sherman always had the courage to say. Cutting-edge diagnostics and treatments may be expensive, but they're life-changing for the people who need them. And it's not about saying no because of the price tag. It's about finding ways to say yes without bankrupting the system, and then they need to act like he always did. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sherman for his reflections on what it takes to move the needle now on reimbursement. So please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome. And so my goals for the talk today are simple. I hope to convince you within 40 minutes or so that innovative payer is not necessarily an oxymoron. I'll talk about some successes, but also some challenges we faced. because it's tough being an innovator on the payer side. And so much of what we've achieved has been based on relationships, but what you may not appreciate is that the hard part wasn't negotiating with industry, it was negotiating internally in many cases, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I don't know what's more surprising looking back, either that we actually accomplished some of these things or I never did manage to get myself fired. I worked all over the healthcare ecosystem, trying really hard not to work for a payer, which happened when I wound up at United, long story, and then Humana, but I've managed to do the job the way I've wanted to, which is really not about saying no to things, not about utilization. And what a terrible job, but understanding we need to control costs, but do it in a value-based framework. How do you give everyone the right incentives? We talked about incentives in an earlier panel, physicians and now pharma and diagnostics, et cetera. And I think that's a much better way to let those who are in a position to make decisions squeeze out the savings and the inefficiencies versus a payer saying no. So I will say that that 12 years, and there are some data points here, that's 3 half-lives for a chief medical officer. So I feel that I frankly had it coming when I got a call from Peter Kolchinsky at RA Capital, who said, "Are you interested in doing something different?" And RA is an amazing organization, some of the smartest people I've ever worked with, and dedicated to doing the right things and not letting some of the payment issues stand in the way, which is just how I feel, just from a different lens. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I've been with them since early April. So, but it has been an interesting trip, so to speak. And as I reflect back, I think back to when I started at the PMC. And the truth is, first meeting or two, they didn't like me at all. And again, I was a little surprised, because usually that takes like weeks, sometimes months. So they didn't like me from the get-go. That's true. And I realized that it wasn't necessarily personal. They just didn't like payers. And if you think about some of the anecdotes we've heard, yes, we'll cover your test if it's an NCCN. Okay, great, we understand the rules. Oh, no, we don't agree anymore. I can kind of understand that. I don't even like payers, and I work for a payer. And I worked for a payer. No, it's true, and I will say I got to do the job the way that I wanted to. The player playbook is, cost savings targets, hit them or else. You see some stories of bad behavior in the press recently involving NaviHealth and medical directors and care managers being forced to use the AI interpretation versus what they're actually seeing from the charts, or recently some things about not paying fully for surveillance colonoscopies, not for those with symptoms, but for those at higher risk. So, that doesn't seem a great way to build a business. So I was much more, and I always have been, about how do you differentiate? How do you make a payer not the card in your wallet, but something you see as an advantage? And I believe that if payers do that correctly, they can actually help on the revenue side, which is a much better way to grow companies in any industry, not just on we're saving more money. But again, I do understand, and I've been part of payers, initiatives where you have very rigorous cost savings targets, and they're not always reasonable. And you have to have the conviction to push back in those situations. And I'm going to give some examples of that also. As Cynthia kind of alluded to, and you've heard this theme from Mike Polini and others, we have this incredible technology. We know how to edit genes. We know how to cure types of cancer. That's amazing. It just disturbs me so much that the reason many patients aren't getting the care they should is because of not the science. It's a reimbursement system. It's how we engage physicians. It's how we transmit information. It's the incentives. And that's kind of crazy and frustrating. So I decided a number of years back, if I'm not smart enough to know how to sequence a gene, it shouldn't be that hard to change the payment system, which doesn't require the same. Yes, I was naive, but it shouldn't be that hard. And the fact is that have the excuse budget impact payment system not designed for it, that's a lousy excuse to give to someone who isn't getting the care that they need and deserve. And my litmus test has always been, what would you want for a member of your family? So, and that guides some of the things I've done and focused on. Let me share a little bit about what payers are looking for, about the payer psyche, and then I'm going to talk about value-based agreements and how they can help overcome barriers. And you know, I heard this internally at RA Capital, you're the black box. Help us understand, and I can understand why they're viewed that way. But a couple of kind of basic principles. One, payers are risk averse. I used to get into debates with some of the other executives. You want to do what? I want to do, here's why. What is Anthem doing, or what is others? I mean, think about that. Executives here are supposed to be a company. The knee-jerk reaction, what are the competitors doing? The inference is, you want to spend money on something, and we're not sure it's a good idea, and if it's such a good idea, how come others aren't spending money on it? Which gets into that chicken or the egg and vicious cycle for those of you who are trying to introduce new technologies. So you know, that's an issue. You know, we worked on ways to de-risk it and put together a framework that helped us get things across the finish line, but it is kind of the psyche you're dealing with. The second point I'll make is there's different dialects of language being spoken. Payers speak clinical utility, and a lot of companies speak clinical validity. That is, a test measures what we say it does, and generally, when there's concern over covering things, that isn't the issue. The clinical utility question is, so does it make a difference? In other words, yes, your test gives you information about someone's propensity to have colon cancer or prostate cancer, whatever. But when you put that into the mix with physicians who may have incentives to do things differently and payment systems and a lot of confusion, does it actually move the needle? Can you show that something has changed in terms of quality, cost, or value? And that's so important. And again, some of the things we did was to try to create these real-world trials. And then the third point I want to make about payers is around real-world evidence. Again, that's a hot topic, if you would. And let me just address that briefly. When you come to a payer with clinical trial data, that is like the car commercial saying the mileage per gallon was blah, 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 and your mileage may vary. And it usually varies, and not for the better. And it's because in clinical trials, and this is true for drugs, it's even more true for diagnostics, I would argue, you have physicians who are really focused on something. They're getting paid, usually for conducting the trial. Patients are followed by clinical research associates or other staff. Everyone kind of does what they're supposed to in following the playbook. You put this out in the wild, and it doesn't always play out that way. I was speaking to a urologist recently asking about a test that can prognosticate prostate cancer, which ones are likely to be aggressive versus not so, and as a follow-on to high PSAs. And he said, that's a black box, I don't believe it, or whatever. So if you were to go to that patient, even if it's, or to that physician, even if it's covered, he would likely dissuade the patient from doing anything with that information. Whether that's because they get paid more for doing biopsies, I don't know. It's always a question. It's not always the answer, but it's something you have to look at. So there are many cases where what happens in these trials doesn't actually get replicated in the real world. And not because of the science, because of all those other implementation issues in our complicated system. So, and I refer to what we did to put the right infrastructure in place. So, and so going back kind of, you know, almost 10 years, we were doing a lot with value-based care for services. And I think everyone would agree, fee-for-service is not a formula for high value. And so we got very engaged. We were doing an early adopter bundle payments for procedures and other things. And we were having a lot of success with that. By the way, as an aside, I remember one case we need more value-based care is oncology. And I still remember I met with the leadership of Dana-Farber. Can I name names? Yeah, go. And they were the chief quality and chief medical. They were super nice, and I said, let's try to do some bundles together. There's some great opportunities here. And they listened. They actually came. They listened. We had a polite conversation, and at the end of it, they said, well, we're good, thank you. So, and the system, I guess, is working for them. But, you know, we were out there. I was out at conferences challenging pharma executives to do value-based care for not just for services, but for drugs and then diagnostics. And we actually had some successes. And initially, most of those were drugs, so the pharmacy team was working on these. And then we did some diagnostics, and I didn't know where to put it. We weren't configured for that. I hadn't really thought about it. Where do you actually, who owns this? So I went to the team doing the services value-based care, and I said, well, this is yours now. Anyone have a problem with that? And they didn't, oddly enough. So, but the best part for me, one of the wins here with this merger that we did, was that I got to tinker with the structure, and I created an entirely new department for this. And you're not supposed to have favorites as a manager or as a parent, but this team was my favorite. And again, part of it is I created it from scratch. So there was no one like legacy, took one of the best managers, made her the VP. Her name's Kate Wallace. We took the best pharmacist off the pharmacy team, put her there to be over the pharmacy vertical, hired, you mentioned Dawn, hired a superb person who knows more about genetic counseling and personalized medicine than I've forgotten, as the saying goes. We hired someone else for digital and others. We hired the best we put all the best people here. And then I even budgeted for their own analysts, because working in a payer, I know that one of the bottlenecks is trying to get your informatics people to do analysis, and usually they'll prioritize the one trying to show where the cost savings opportunities are. So I made them self-sufficient. And then through a variety of tactics, put together their own budget. So now you've got this self-contained unit, and the beauty of this was not just that they're just a superb team, but think about that budget question, which is now $4 million a year, not for their salaries, for doing pilots. So that means that when there's an opportunity that doesn't fit into a category, let's say a digital therapeutic, offering Revio for migraines, for example, or GRAIL, multi-cancer early detection, we'll talk more about that. There's not the question in the debate, how do we pay for this? There's no need, for the majority of these, which are new and we're not really sure, we're not charging the patient anything. We don't need to figure out how to adjudicate the claims. We're just paying for it out of that budget. And then the head of that commercial line of business can't come to us and say, you're spending my money on something that may not work. So turned out that was actually part of the secret sauce, and now we have this entity that companies can go to and experiment with. And I see these as, again, real-world pilots, working with companies in therapeutics and diagnostics and other areas to try things in limited settings. These are not, yes, we're covering it, permanent. This is, let's try something, real world, see how it works, and then either say, yeah, it's working, let's make it permanent, it didn't work, sorry, or let's course correct. And I view that as a huge opportunity, not just to disproportionately bring access to our patients, but if you think about it from the perspective of that risk element on payers, I was also de-risking it. Because in most of these cases, if not all, the vast majority, they're going at risk for the cost of the test or some aspect tied to results. And now, we're conducting it in the real world with multiple providers and markets, et cetera. So that really is real world data. So one of the other, side effects of benefit here is we're actually spinning off real world data that others can look at and copy, and we're impacting the environment, not just for our membership, but throughout the country. So that was, again, that's why we were getting up in the morning. So all that is a great model. As I did say, it's not easy working in a payer, and sometimes it seemed harder to negotiate, internally. So I'm not going to spend 45 minutes talking about how tough it is, but you should understand when you see payers do some stupid things, and you wonder what are they thinking, it means someone set a financial target, someone's job or bonus is tied to it, and no one has a conviction to stand up. And I'll share probably one of my worst examples of something that Harvard Pilgrim almost did. The head of the commercial market felt that we had too sick a population in New Hampshire, and we did compete with different entities in different states. And she felt that our formulary was too generous. And so we actually kind of compromised, and we'll come up with a different New Hampshire formulary that takes into account the competitive forces. This colleague, who worked in a payer, she had this strongly held idea: we should not cover cystic fibrosis drugs. I'm not making this up. This is Harvard Pilgrim, an entity which for 10 years ranked the #1 health plan in the country for quality before they retired the ranking. And she meant it. We had a number of tough discussions. And I tried to explain to her, this is a terrible idea. For whole variety of reasons, most of which are patient-centric, but I tried, I realized that tactic wasn't working, so I did say, patients are going to be talking about this online and with the center, this is not good. And she said, good, I want that. And I said, this is going to be overturned on appeal whenever it goes out there, we're going to pay for it anyway, only everyone's going to hate us. And she said, yes, but next time when new patients and families with CF family members are looking for insurance, they'll choose someone else. And that's a true story. It took, it's like the angriest I've ever been, and my pharmacists, who were really the heart and soul, they were even more ticked off. And, it went to the CO level, and he backed me, and they would have, I was chair of the P&T committee and controlled that, but they would have had to fire me to do that, which at that point I was so angry I didn't care, but I'm pretty sure it's like firing your auditors because they won't sign off on your financial statements. It's not something that they can really do. But so you have to really have conviction in this and at some point, and it is easier for most CMOs and medical directors, just go with the flow and do your best and kind of wait for it to blow up and don't take it personally. Other examples, post-merger, a few months before I joined RA, we were sitting in an executive team meeting discussing the fact that the pharmacy spend was $35 million higher than projected. And I don't want to say I'm the smartest guy in the room, but I was the only person in this room of executives with any kind of clinical background. So I was probably the only one who understood the drugs and what actually was causing it. And I did what I would have done before. I told them the truth. And I said, the reason that our spend is higher, it isn't because we're not doing our jobs. We're not saying yes to some drug we shouldn't be saying yes to. We're doing things appropriate. There are no surprises. The actuaries, who have a very tough job of predicting the future, they guessed wrong. So we're off against the actuarial assumptions, and there's nothing to be done here. And I remember this was kind of one of the insights that, boy, this newly merged company is different, because in the past, that would have been the end of it. The chief operating officer stood up and said, okay, I'll take this on. I'm going to find the $35 million. And I remember looking on in disbelief thinking, and this is not a clinical person, yes, we deliver targets, he's off message. So again, it's tough being in a payer environment. Despite that, we did a lot of good and did move the needle. One of the first value-based agreements that we did was with Amgen for Repatha. And so we'd been out there challenging. We had a couple of small ones. We had the benefit that Repatha and Praluent, if you recall, came out at the same time. And I viewed that as more or less interchangeable, highly effective drugs. So we met with Amgen, and they agreed that they would go at risk for cholesterol lowering to an extent related to the price of the drug. We quickly figured out that was like the stupidest deal ever, because these drugs work highly effectively. So that did not move in. However, that morphed into something, I'm proud to say, where they actually went at risk for something a lot more interesting, which is if someone on the drug for 6 months or more had a cardiovascular event, they would refund the entire cost of the drug, which I will say the rate was very low. So, that's really putting conviction. It's hard to say no to that in terms of your coverage policies. But let me share an example. And this is worth thinking about for companies or investors, where a value-based deal could have made a difference. So, and it's also about this class of drugs, PCSK9s. So when the drugs came out, they were $12,000 a year, $13,000 a year, and then they fell with traditional rebates, and they're now in the $4,000 to $5,000 range. Still more than statins, but these are incredibly effective drugs. So they also need to be administered self-injected every 2 to 4 weeks. So it's a little bit of a pain, but they're highly effective. So it comes to my attention that there's a company called the Medicines Company, and they have something called inclisiran, which is an RNAi version that only needs to be given twice a year. And that's pretty interesting. And it also appears to be highly effective. And again, what would I want for a member of my family? I'd want them to get the twice-a-year injection. And so the head of the medicines company, some of you know, is a person who I share a lot of attributes with of wanting to do things differently. His name's Clive Meanwell. And we ended up meeting, and we had the idea of doing what some call the Netflix model, the population-based model. So that would be, we will pay you X million a year, whatever that is, and whatever of your inclisiran is needed for the population gets provided. It changes the dynamic for a payer, not let's keep people from it, let's make sure everyone who needs it gets it, and let's keep people off all the other drugs. And then for the pharma company, it provides a certain guaranteed revenue stream and some certainty as to earnings, which are obviously good for investors and others. So I thought that was great. The only problem was the drug hadn't been approved yet, and I had to keep telling Clive, no, I really can't agree to this until the drug is FDA approved, even though we knew it was coming. So they get acquired by Novartis for $9.7 billion based on that drug. And I don't know what happened. I've done some really interesting deals with Novartis for Entresto and Zolgensma, but this thing got dropped completely. We couldn't figure out how to engage them. And you know, so it didn't happen. So I want to fast forward. Again, they paid $9.7 billion for the company. Repatha sales, I didn't track, but Repatha alone, one of the two major ones, was over $1 billion last year. Inclisiran sales for the first half of 23, US, they're not sharing worldwide numbers, was $78 million. That's probably not a good thing if you're Novartis. And they could have gotten around that by doing this value-based deal. Because it's hard to do deals, population-based, that say you have to take a drug. You've got to take this diabetes drug. This rheumatology drug. People would be saying, you're an evil payer, you're trying to kill me, you know, all the usual stuff they say about payers. But nobody would complain about a drug that only needed to be injected twice a year versus every 2 to 4 weeks. But that didn't happen, and that could have changed the dynamic. So that's an example where a value-based agreement could have actually changed things. Again, we did a lot of other interesting deals. I also want to talk about what we did with on gene therapies, because I think that's the biggest use case here. You know, in that case, even if they're worth it, and many of these are worth it, so, you know, we could have a discussion about GCAA, and there's a chart out there about generalized cost-effective analysis and how you should think about value. But again, this is something you would want for a member of your family. But it's hard to argue it's worth that if it doesn't work. So there was the idea of, well, really a value-based agreement should be part of it. And the first one we did was with Spark. And it just so happened, it came about because I was in a meeting just like this. This was at Duke Margolis Center that Mark McClellan was managing. We were talking about high-cost drugs. Jeff Marazzo, the head of Spark, was across the table, and I challenged him. I kind of made those points, and that led to an agreement. They actually went at risk over multiple years for a portion of the price of the drug for Luxturna, for RP 65-minute blindness. And they didn't have to do that. This is one of those things that you are not going to not cover. It's rare, blindness, kids. This is not a good thing not to cover, and everyone did cover it. So, you know, that kind of set the stage for gene therapy of this should really be part of the discussion, and we were at the forefront of doing that with Zolgensma and some of the Bluebird drugs and others. A lot of these are money back. There's other models that I think are out there, and I think about this now with the same question from an investor hat. How do you sell solutions? So in these situations where you have these drugs, maybe accelerated approval, which Scott talked about earlier, and you're not really sure, you think it's a cure, you think it's 10 years of value, whatever, you can guarantee that through example, not even just by cashback, which can be complicated, but by arguing that you'll provide whatever other treatments are needed if necessary. And we did a version of that with Alnylam and Patisiran, where they said, for example, if someone needed a liver transplant, they would pay part of it. And that was myself and their executives brainstorming in a room. It's interesting, you know, this is all about trust and relationships, and I know, you know, there's examples on all sides of people not behaving well, but I found so much in my career that you sit down, particularly with the smaller companies, diagnostics, therapeutics, and others, they are true believers. You know, we saw that video about multiple sclerosis. You know, that's a passion. And they want to do the right thing. They want to engage, they want to go at risk. They want access. And so, and you sit down and focus on the patient, you work through the details. Once that's your center, you figure out the economics in the model, and it just all works. And I found that time and time again. So the interesting postscript on Luxturna, by the way. So we did that. We were the first to do that. So we were mentioned in the press release, and similar with Zolgensma, actually, because I always believed we should call out the pharma companies in a good way for doing the right thing and for being good corporate citizens standing behind their product. And this might amuse you. So Luxturna comes out, there's a press release. Now we had and again, apologies to I like actuaries, they're fine people, but we had a former chief actuary who was no longer with the company, but somehow had a consulting agreement. He sees a press release, he sends a note to the CFO, who sends to me with a question mark. The note basically said, your idiot CMO, Sherman, just killed your company because everyone who needs this drug is going to join Harvard Pilgrim, which is an adverse selection issue that people worry about. So I composed a response. I then waited 5 minutes, and I took out all the expletive deleted and stuff, and you expletive moron. I took that out, and I said very calmly, everyone is going to cover this. We don't have an adverse selection. Let's focus on differentiation and showing that we care about our members. And of course, everyone did cover it. But that was a knee-jerk response before anyone even understood what we had done. It says something about the psyche. I've been talking about pharmaceuticals, diagnostics. We saw that as being the next opportunity, and probably more in need of ways to bridge differences and demonstrate real-world data, frankly, than drugs. One of the challenges, and again, it's a theme here, is it's hard for payers not to cover a drug for a condition if it's FDA approved, or particularly if it's the only drug out there. But there's no such pressure for diagnostics. So the first agreement we did, and Cynthia referred to this, it was with Illumina. And essentially, at that point, we, like many payers, and again, this has changed in large part, and I'm proud that we were part of generating the data, for the most part, the NIPT molecular testing for trisomies, including Downs and others, was limited to women over 35 because the risk is higher. On the other hand, at least when I last looked at the data at that time, maybe 5 years ago, 80% of the cases of Downs were born to women under 35 because of the number of pregnancies. Illumina basically made the argument, you're paying for these less precise tests. They're leading to unnecessary amnios, which have quality issues and costs, et cetera. And they actually did something that gave me the freedom to open up the policy. And we said, we'll make the policy for any woman who, regardless of age. And they basically made they warranted that we would not see any increase in total cost because it would displace other less precise tests and we'd have fewer false positives or negatives, and basically that the world would be better. And sure enough, that happened. The truth is that we saw a slight increase. I think that our total cost went up $70,000, which, to be accurate, which was minimal. They wrote us a check for that to our company, and we left the policy like that, and a lot of others paid attention. And it said, gee, we can do this with diagnostics. That's kind of cool. And I remember I going to my colleagues, I said, let's do, it's like getting a taste of the drug. I said, let's do something even cooler. How about whole genome sequencing? And again, you're seeing more of it now, but it wasn't widely covered. And the interesting lesson here, so we met with our genetic benefit manager who thought it was a bad idea. They're in the business of saving us money. And I looked at it and said, look what it's costing us for that 7-year, these are for kids on that diagnostic odyssey. And sometimes you'll find a diagnosis, but at least even if you don't, you'll stop all the other point testing. So we launched that, and until very recently, there was no uptake. And this gets back to those other implementation issues. And I kept asking, what's going on? And we finally figured out that the main children's hospital that we deal with was so sure that nobody was paying for it that they had put edits in their online ordering system so their docs can order it. And even once we identified that, it took a lot of work to fix. And I've checked it recently, and that actually has been addressed. Let me also talk about GRAIL. I want to talk about 2 other diagnostics, what I think are successes. So multi-cancer early detection, again, we've talked about that quite a bit today. I think we need to figure out exactly where it belongs, how it fits in. But there's a lot of excitement, and it seems to me this is something people are going to want. And so again, given how I look at the world, I said we can either stick our head in the sand, or let's get some experience with this in this innovation area, in a way that's safe financially, and let's see what this looks like. Are we really detecting cancers earlier and helping people? Is it worth it? What's the right population? So I started as a real-world pilot. We actually called up the head of GRAIL, who's named Josh Offman, who I had a relationship with him. He was on the other side of our agreement with Amgen for Repatha. Again, strong relationship. So it was actually very easy to get to an agreement. They went at risk for a part of the cost of the test, and we decided we were going to offer it initially to our employees. So yes, I took it. And then, in the interest of trying pilots in different populations, the second group was the main exchange. We had a population. The exchange population is like poorer, more Medicaid-like, more diverse. So we thought that was a good group. And then the third group recently rolled out to was actually in conjunction with Mass General Cancer Center. So I'm proud of that. Again, there's a lot to learn about these and the whole variety of tests out there, but I think it's good to get experience. Now, that's all. Let me tell you the downsides here, because again, as I said, you really need to have conviction. The CEO was really excited about this, and suggested that we present it to our board of directors. And what happened next, I didn't anticipate at all. And again, this is a different board that was some new people, a combination of the Tufts and Harvard Pilgrim boards. And Harvard Pilgrim was, which I certainly typified, ask for forgiveness if anyone bothers, and Tufts was ask for permission. And those Tufts genes had been dominant, I guess, in the board. So we present this, and I got in my head, it's like my worst board meeting ever. They're like, the comments were literally, "This sounds too good to be true. Is this another Theranos?" And I'm like, no, there's the methylation, there's science here. This sounds like another Theranos. Who's keeping an eye on him, and this group? Somebody Googles one of the board members and says, the FTC is trying to block their acquisition by Illumina. I'm like, you don't understand. This is, I think it's going to work, and they'll have two big market share. So it went on like that. I got my head handed to me. And again, the whole thing is bizarre. Where we left it, we lost 3 months, and it was, okay, I have to, I guess, get back to the board and convince them it's okay. And we spent the next 3 months in the team showing them the due diligence, convince them it was okay, and finally launched it. And even after we had said, your board members, kind of like employees, you can get the test. They actually, after a while, they said, yes, we want the test. So that we won them over, but it was just a reminder how much the company had changed, and I was very surprised by that. And again, I won't speak negatively of the board, but it's a board of a healthcare company, yes, an insurance, but a healthcare company. One would think that they would have a better understanding of some things involving, healthcare and where things are going. So, the other interesting fact that was also a reminder how much the company had changed. So after 2 months, the COO, whose office is next to mine, sees me and said, so he asked about the GRAIL pilot. And she said, how's it going? How much money have we saved so far? And I'm like, first of all, it's a long-term study. Second, couldn't you have asked how many cases of cancer have we found early that would have otherwise not been found? Not how much, but it's, so yes, if you hate payers, I get it. I won't try to convince you, but again, and even innovative companies have challenges. And so I'm going to take questions, but I want to share one other thing that was launched recently before I left that I'm super proud of, and super proud of our team. And that was with Foundation Medicine. We talked a lot about comprehensive genomic profiling, all the challenges, the fact that people should get it. You'd want it if you had lung cancer or many other types. And for many reasons, it's not being provided broadly to the majority of the population. So one of the challenges is, and again, Scott kind of alluded to this, we had a broad policy for Medicare, but it was more restrictive for commercial because some people were not clear on the value. So we struck a deal with Foundation. They actually essentially went at risk and guaranteed that certain patients would have more targeted therapy, a certain percentage, which would save money as well as be better care. And this part was unusual, and I'm super proud of, that a certain percentage would end up in clinical trials, and they were providing information to the doc about the clinical trials. Now, the reason that's important is not just if the clinical trial is right for them, and that's best care, they should get it. But that allowed me to go back and kind of smooth things over, at the company, at the insurance company, saying, you guys do know that if they're in a clinical trial, we don't pay for the drug. And that's underway, and I think that's a great way, again, to de-risk the financial decision to pay for something on the part of the payer. And again, if I were the company, and I say this companies we work with, that data is so important. It's as important, if not more so, than the initial revenue, because that lets you answer all the questions about clinical utility, real world, et cetera. So, I'm since I moved on to other pastures and love every day, and I do not miss a lot of the need to be combative with my colleagues to do the right thing, but there is a team in place which is still there. And super capable and doing some great work in terms of future innovative pilots. So we have a few minutes left. I'll open it up to questions. Thank you.
Hi, Michael. That was a great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I just wanted you to comment specifically on some of the challenges around picking what are the outcomes measures for these, and how do you collect the data, who analyzes the data, and then, what I really appreciated was that you did publish, for example, the NIPT project that you did with Illumina. And as a researcher, I found that very informative. So can you talk about all of those sorts of issues? Thanks.
Yeah. It's a complicated question. I'm going to be brief by necessity. So for most of the times, we think about the outcome measures as being things that are easy to measure, generally are claims-based. I didn't talk about our Entresto pilot with Novartis for the heart failure drug, but they warranted certain reductions in readmission for heart failure, which you can get from claims easily. What we found, though, is when you're talking about things like, again, Luxturna or even Zolgensma, you're talking about things that are hard to measure, you may need some human attention to capturing that information. But the positive there is these are super small populations. If you're talking about large populations and hard to get measures, no one has truly solved for that. That's why even for some of the things around hemophilia, they're looking at whether people need transfusions, et cetera, as a shortcut to getting that information. So we purposely tried to be smart about measures. And sometimes there is a balance between, getting it done and getting it done best. So an example, we had one of the few agreements we did was with Takeda for Lundbrig, ALK-positive non-small cell lung cancer. And we could debate here what the right measures are. Is it progression-free survival, overalls, et cetera? You know what the measure was? Do they fill the prescription more than twice? And because if they're not, the belief is, which is fair, either the side effects are really, really bad, or it's not working for them. So again, you could argue that's not the best measure in the world, but it's elegant in its simplicity that it's easy to measure. And by the way, I really thank Takeda for that, because they figured out after we started talking that because of regulations whereby health plans can nudge in a different direction, but can't say no in most states to anything FDA approved, that we actually could not make that the preferred in the class, but they still went ahead with it. I'd love to see more on the oncology side. I think this is one, because of the messiness and the regs, I think you really need a strong value-based agreement with providers who are then making the decisions, and almost think of it as three-way deals. I think there's a lot that can be done there, and it's the next horizon, but progress has been slow for a variety of reasons. So, and the other thing is, and it was unique to us, we had our institute, the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School, so when we do some of these studies, the whole genome and others, we can tap into those academics who are really good at clinical trial support and real-world evidence generation. I do think, by the way, it's an unmet need, and there are companies we've looked at that are trying to be the aggregator. So I kind of didn't care about this, honestly, as being the early adopter and the first to do it. That's between us, and we'll exchange information with the company. If you're talking about, and keep in mind, there's a couple of large payers, but there's hundreds in the US. If you're looking at that broadly, you probably need infrastructure. So I view that as being, my problem was not a lack of infrastructure, it's a lack of deals, right? So, but that is a need, for sure. Other questions? I've worn everyone out, or bored people or something. Anyway.
Please join me in thanking Michael.
Thank you very much.
For his candor and for his great insight into the reimbursement black box. Now, my pleasure to welcome Kim Popovits, who in turn will introduce a panel on developing diagnostics for personalized medicine. A brief word about Kim, who serves on PMC's board. Kim is associated with the two iconic products of personalized medicine, and I like to believe that it's her leadership that made them possible. The first one is Herceptin at Genentech, still the poster child of personalized medicine therapy, and secondly, as you all probably know, Oncotype DX, which she brought to the market in her capacity as President and CEO of Genomic Health. So Kim, please come to the stage and share with us your views about diagnostics with your distinguished panel.
Okay, I brought an all-star team with me. And we're hoping for a lively discussion, and we will take questions too, so I'll try to be mindful of anybody walking up to a microphone. Well, thank you, Ed, for the kind introduction. Actually, hearing that, I'm starting to feel a little old up here, but we've done some good work. We've done a lot of good work together. Ed reminded me in an email just a couple of weeks ago, he said, hey, I was doing some reading, and I came across this quote of yours from 2005 when you did a case study for Stanford, the Stanford Business School on Oncotype DX. We had just launched it, and so I read the quote, and I have to say I kind of chuckled, and I'm going to paraphrase it here for you. Now I said my quote was, "The healthcare system must recognize diagnostics with the same value proposition as therapeutics. Our business model depends on changing that paradigm. If we accepted that diagnostics don't deserve the same level of recognition for the value they bring, we would jeopardize our business model, not just for Genomic Health's first product, but for all that would follow." And I sit here now, almost 2 decades later, right? And we start to talk about some of the barriers that we'll be talking about in this panel. And I don't want to sound negative about this, because we have indeed made a lot of progress. I mean, just look at this room filled with not just incredible people and visionaries, but a lot of work that has changed, millions and millions of lives around the world. Some of the conversation is still the same. If you look, though, today at the number of companion diagnostics and tests that are approved with targets, it's dramatically improved. I think it's around 35% today versus almost nothing back 20 years ago. And the other thing it reminded me of is that a very wise entrepreneur at the time, when we were talking about how disruptive, what we were doing was to both, whether it was the payer community or even the medical community. And I remember he said, true disruption generally can take, 10 to 20 years to actually get into mainstream. And I remember thinking at that time, this just can't happen. We have a test that can tell women whether or not they benefit from chemotherapy. How could that take 10 to 20 years to become standard of care? And what we learned along the way is it does, because in being disruptive, you're bringing problems right into a system that is not it isn't ready to accommodate it. And so we had to figure out how to be a part of a solution for all of that. So if I'm doing my math correctly, 2005 today, that's 18 years. So 10 to 20 years. We've got 2 years to get across that finish line, and I think we're going to do it. But we will talk today on the panel about the areas we wanted to cover are the barriers that still remain today to the lack of recognition of diagnostics and value creation. The second is just, what do we view the future of the development of diagnostics to look like? And then if we have a little bit of time, we talked earlier, the panel was around investing, and that was predominantly, I think, in therapeutics, but maybe talk a little bit about with some of the work that especially Jay is now doing, is, what does the investment look like in diagnostics in the future? Because we probably wouldn't look at the track record today over the last 10 years as something that would look attractive, but I don't think that will be the case over the long haul. And I think Mike mentioned it earlier on the panel. We feel very optimistic about the future of the field, the importance of the field, and the importance of the field in developing new therapeutics for all. So I'm not going to read bios because you have them in the materials, but I did want each panelist to just briefly, say who they are. And I always ask people to just give one fun fact that nobody would know about you Googling. So go for it. Helmi, you want to go start?
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a co-founder, co-CEO of Garden Health. Before that, I was at Illumina, and before that, I was at the Genome Center. So I've been working around the periphery of personalized medicine and precision medicine for about 2 decades. And at Guardant, we're very excited to hopefully have FDA approval for a screening liquid biopsy next year so that we can really make a dent in terms of deaths from colorectal cancer. That's a dangerous question in terms of the fun fact. Let me see. So, one thing that I'm really excited about is sort of not just the near term, but the long term. And so I recently joined the board of SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and it's very exciting. We just got a $200 million grant from one of the Qualcomm founders. So yeah, we may be able to answer some age-old questions very soon of why we exist, or if you see me at the bar, maybe I'll tell you if we found aliens or not. So.
Chad.
Cool. Hi, my name is Chad Robbins. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Adaptive Biotechnologies. Adaptive is an interesting company in that we're a company that's in personalized medicine, both on the diagnostic side and in the drug discovery therapeutic side. We have a commercial test in cancer diagnostics in the field of minimal residual disease, which we'll talk more about, called clonoSEQ. And on the drug discovery side, which is also kind of somewhat partnered with a diagnostic bent in terms of a biomarker. We've been mapping T-cell receptors to antigen at scale with our partner Microsoft to essentially be able to stratify patients and find novel targets. Our first efforts in therapeutics is a partnership with Genentech in personalized cell therapy, but now we're developing our own pipeline in the autoimmune space, which we're using the information from our immune-related assays to really hone in on kind of what to target. And then from a personal standpoint, fun fact, I guess, I spent 100 days in the wilderness in my college years, and I think that shaped a lot of kind of who I am and also how I think about leadership. So.
Thank you. My name is Mia Levy. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Foundation Medicine. Thank you again for having me on this panel. I am a breast medical oncologist, still seeing patients. Thank you for Oncotype. It's been a hugely transformative part of our practice. And I've been at Foundation Medicine for about 2.5 years, and I'm excited to continue to bring forth our innovation in therapeutics, targeted therapeutics, and companion diagnostics to help drive patients' decision-making for their care. But I'm really excited about this future of moving beyond the which treatment to give, but that question of, doc, did you get it all? The minimal residual disease question, or is my treatment working? The monitoring of response to therapy, and finally the screening for cancers that are difficult to screen for which we don't have any tests. So this is an incredibly exciting time in precision oncology, and just excited to see these new paradigms of care emerge and help develop them. As a fun fact, we were talking about this over lunch, and Jay was making fun of me because I couldn't read the paper that he just handed me, and I've gotten to that age where, my arms are getting a little shorter, but I see that Jay has me covered, and so do you, Chad, for my readers, should I need them on the panel tonight. So thanks so much. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, I'm Jay Wolgamuth. I do use readers, and I know I need them. Just a brief background, I was a co-founder of CareDx, and I would say Kim's making me feel old because that took 10 to 15 years, actually, to come to fruition. And that's where I got into the diagnostics field. I've been at Genentech Roche working on drug development and biomarkers. I didn't like working on drug programs that you're working on something 10 years in the future. And I landed at Quest Diagnostics off and on for 14 years as the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer. I would say my perspective today is going to be all about implementation science and this question of, we're really good at delivering the scientific goods these days in our field, but there's just so much which is not implemented at scale. And so I'm going to talk a lot about that today. My fun fact links with yours, actually. I am doing the Pacific Crest Trail in segments. And I'll go like 30 or 40 miles at a time. And the good news is I've done 300 miles, but the bad news is it's 2,600 miles. So maybe in another decade, I'll get it done.
Thanks, Jay. Okay, now I feel old and lazy.
Yeah. Perfect.
Oh my goodness. Actually, not planned, but that's where we'll start, is with implementation science. When we had a pre-call a couple of months ago, we were talking about if we had to list today what we think the barriers to recognition and value creation are. The four things that I think we all really aligned on were physician training, patient awareness, regulation, and reimbursement. And in that discussion, Jay, you brought up this, concept of implementation science, which kind of encompasses all of those. So maybe we can start with you elaborating on that a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll give the perspective of the barrier is the U.S. healthcare system. No, it is. It is our barrier because the system is incredibly fragmented, difficult to navigate, not value-based, and completely misaligned in many places, right? So if you're developing a standalone diagnostic into that environment, the implementation is extremely difficult, extremely difficult. So that leads me to say two things. As we go forward, you have to either have a holistic solution that is not just a test, but is a solution that might include virtual care or virtual genetic counseling or reimbursement services. You have to have that full solution and or a very direct linkage of your implementation to a therapeutic intervention. And I think if we think about the old model, Kim, of a standalone CLIA lab with a molecular diagnostic, please don't do that, right? You've got to either have the full ability to implement, and let me just give the quick example. Pharmacogenetics. How many years have we known about the relationship between drugs and very meaningful pharmacogenetic interactions? So my first assignment at Quest Diagnostics in 2009 was to implement pharmacogenetics. So I went down to Dr. Topol, we put it in his cath lab, and it was a freaking disaster, failure, okay? And there were a lot of reasons for that, but it was just a test, right? So to go forward 15 years, 20 years, now we have implementation of pharmacogenetics at scale, and the reason is it's been done in self-insured health plans, and also it's been done with complete services, including digital pharmacists assisting the patient, assisting the doctor. And that gives you just a good example of the difference between a lab test and a holistic solution. And then the last part, I'll go back to what Michael was talking about, is we have to do this implementation in what I would call aligned environments. And there aren't a lot of aligned environments in healthcare, unfortunately, in our world, in our country in particular, but there are places like integrated health systems that have health plans. That's an aligned environment. A self-insured employer who is caring for 50,000 members, my incentives are very clear and very pure. So there are, and increasingly value-based care environments that Michael was talking about. So I think if you try to implement these things in a misaligned environment, it's going to be really challenging.
I think, too, at lunch you mentioned, which I thought was so important, is when we talk about the payer, it's important to understand who is the payer, right?
I always cringe with that a little bit because I ran the Quest Health Plan, and we're the payer. And for a self-insured employer, the employer is paying for the health care for my population. And 110 million Americans, in the U.S. get their health insurance that way. And I may be working with UHC, I may be working with Aetna, but they're not on the hook. I'm on the hook, and I'm running the plan. So I think somehow we got to figure out how to harness that. Where incentives are aligned, and employers are managing their populations for 8 to 10 years on average. So.
Yeah, and I personally think that is going to be the best angle in to do what you're suggesting, to create that system, to create the implementation science that can really move all this into mainstream. Helma, you mentioned, which I also thought was interesting, that is high reimbursement and quality, a low regulatory environment, is that compatible when we think about?
I mean, I think sometimes it's like it's an unforced error, kind of a self-goal that we have in the diagnostics industry in some ways, where we want the bar to be, essentially very low to be able to get these tests out there. But that does us a disservice in the long run, because at the end of the day, you have to establish the right level of quality, clinical validity, clinical utility in the right studies. And you have a lot of experience on the therapeutic side, and we all know that once you have a FDA approval, that you've really established that clinical utility. And that's why the system, essentially, I think rewards that high bar with protected classes and guaranteed reimbursement for certain therapeutics. And here we are on the diagnostic side, and I think it is a sort of facet of you get what you pay for. We don't pay a lot to get into the market, and which is good from an innovation point of view, but I think it's hard from a physician point of view, a payer point of view. How do they judge which tests are actually at the right level of evidence, the right standards to be able to be used on their patients? And so that's where I think there is a balance. I think the bar does have to be increased slightly, because you're going to pay one way or another. Here we are. We launched our test, our liquid biopsy, in 2014. It's taken, I think, something like 400 publications, 9 years to finally get to 300 million covered lives. And so you're going to pay one way or another. I think it's better for the industry if we stand together. We stand shoulder to shoulder. We protect the structural integrity in terms of gross margins, reimbursement, and sort of pay it forward rather than expect it on the back end.
So as a way to do that, you mentioned on our call the state biomarker mandates. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the exciting things is really playing a larger role in terms of the sort of government affairs piece, and really thinking about how do you link the fact that Medicare tends to be the first to cover these diagnostic tests. They tend to be a lot more forward-looking. Yet private payers are often off the hook in terms of actually standing with Medicare in terms of the same coverage criteria. And so this is really where working with American Cancer Society, we've had a lot of success in terms of establishing essentially this idea that certain population of certain states are required to have coverage if certain cancer tests are covered by Medicare. And so now there are about 13 states where these mandates have been passed. If you think about that in terms of how we've now changed the structural landscape for cancer testing, those 13 states, I think, cover around 200 million lives, or close to 200 million lives. And so if you think about it, once you have Medicare now, which typically covers in the cancer population about 40% to 50% of the population, you get another 200 million lives where private payers are required to cover those patients as well. That is now about 70 to 75% of the population covered as soon as you get a Medicare approval. And I think that has been the biggest challenge. Is there's so many different plans out there, and they all have great, they have great medical directors and so on, but the bar is different. It's like applying to 300 different colleges and trying to get into all of them. Like you have to write a different essay question, and the bar is different. So I think this sort of unification of standards around diagnostics would be a huge win for the industry.
So that's a nice segue to FDA's, I won't say announcement, but publishing, their intent to regulate LDTs and putting out a potential framework that they've asked for industry feedback on. So MIA Foundation probably has some of the deepest and longest experience in this regard. Impressions from you?
Yeah, thank you so much. We certainly, as the first FDA-regulated NGS test, it's been a really long journey, and we've continued year after year to have multiple companion diagnostics as part of our assay to really differentiate what quality means. And we really believe that not all lab-developed tests are equivalent, and that there is risk that some patients may get an inferior test and not have the important biomarker that either if a false positive would result in them getting a drug that will not benefit them, or a false negative where they wouldn't even have the opportunity to receive that medication, and that a high quality framework is needed to be able to differentiate. And there's many testing companies on the market, or even just internally developed hospital-based lab tests, and it's very difficult for the payers to be able to differentiate between what quality looks like and which ones they should cover and which ones they shouldn't. And we believe that the FDA has put this guidance forward for public comment, and to regulate all laboratory-developed tests in some framework. And Foundation Medicine has gone through that process now with our basic test, but also with each companion diagnostic that we do to validate that, in fact, those particular biomarkers can be identified on our panel and not just a sweep of the entire panel. So we do believe that there should be a regulatory framework that is a single framework, not multiple frameworks, because unfortunately with a lack of a framework, various payers are creating their own, right? And the states are creating their own, and it becomes very difficult to be able to manage because there is a lack of a single framework. So we believe that there should be a single framework that should be risk-based on the results of these laboratory-developed tests. And whether or not that's an FDA process or a legislative process, it doesn't, we don't have a strong opinion on who should bring that legislation forward or those rulemakings forward, but we do believe that patients are the one who will benefit the most by having more transparency over the quality of the tests that are being given, especially as it relates to a therapeutic that they either are going to be eligible for or not eligible for based on the results.
Chad or Jay, do you want to comment?
Can you comment on the value so you went through FDA approval for the foundation test, but there is some value that comes back, so you're differentiated because you have an FDA approval, but then I think we were saying earlier there are health plans that will cover only the FDA cleared test, and that's actually happening now to some extent, it sounds like?
So Michael gave the example of United Healthcare just this past year. Has not covered any large panel NGS test historically. They were covering small panel and minus less than 50 gene panels. And for the first time, they were able to use this quality narrative of the FDA approval to enable them for coverage of those tests, including Foundation Medicine and Guardant, for those indications for which there is a companion diagnostic or an FDA-regulated process.
But on the other hand, we don't have a guarantee if we have an FDA approval of a new diagnostic that we will be paid. Right?
No.
So in this case, you have a really nice incentive. But I
Well,
think that
when it works out, I mean, that was back to your 15-year comment, right? We received FDA approval in 2014. It took 9 years for us to get coverage on United's health plan.
Yeah.
And there are significant costs then associated too with,
And hundreds and hundreds of publications.
I don't want to be repetitive, but that's the issue, right? You spend all the resources and the time and effort to go through the agency, which, by the way, they don't have the resources to regulate. You get an approval. To what end? Mike mentioned this earlier. There's no carrot there that says hey, you're guaranteed coverage. You're not even guaranteed coverage yet. I mean, there was a dual track pathway that Foundation and Exact went through. Adaptive has been through on 3 different indications. Why did we do that? We thought it would help with coverage, maybe marginally. What it really helped with was our pharma side of the business, where because you had an FDA-approved test, and same with the pharma was much more likely to use you in their clinical trials. But without kind of this universal coverage, there's the incentive to go through that, and it all, by the way, works together. This is all related between regulation and regulatory payment, and then you mentioned state biomarker legislation, right? So that's state by state, right? And now, but there's no kind of universal biomarker legislation that says if Medicare covers you, then private payers should cover you. So you're going through, I like your analogy of 300 college applications, but many of you who aren't in diagnostics, I'll just give you the pathway, which is you're doing hand-to-hand combat. You go through an HTA, a health technical assessment with every payer. Some of them group them together, and you do not know what's going to be required from each one of these HTAs. And in many cases, unlike Michael Sherman, who you're dealing directly with someone who can make a decision, you're not dealing with a decision maker. So there's no timeline. There is no bar that you know that you have to cross. So the frustration, so literally you're hand-to-hand combat. Now, I would say on the positive side in quotes, it provides, if you go through that, there's like a nice barrier to entry because it's really, really hard to get through. But that shouldn't be the case because it stifles not only innovation, it stifles investment, right? Because the investors are saying without a clean path, we're not going to invest. We're not going to invest in innovative technologies. At the direct time when you've got AI and all these amazing diagnostic technologies that are coming to, are really being enabled by new technologies, there's going to be, and again, I'll give my optimistic view later on some of this stuff, but there's really a challenge to get these companies funded when we know how important these diagnostics are, not only also to stratify patients in trials so that we can have better therapeutics as well. So there's a lot there, but these are all related. And I'll give one more point and then yield the floor, which is in these state biomarker, the insurance company, the payers are funded much better than the diagnostic companies. The Personalized Medicine Conference, Brooke Byers started Coalition for 21st Century Medicine, AdvaMedDX, ACLA, I can give another 10 organizations, acronyms, that are all at the top of their agenda. We all talk about it, is we got to change the payer landscape for diagnostics, but no, we haven't united to do it, and to come together, to get a voice, to be on the Hill in a way that has the right resources behind it, that you can actually effectuate real change. And we need to do that. So you say we got 2 years left? Well, to your 20-year horizon, we got to step up and put the resources behind it to do it. And pharma has to be a big part of that because they're better resources than the diagnostic companies.
So that's an interesting comment. So in most stakeholders, as I'm thinking through it as you're mentioning the acronyms, are fairly well aligned. I mean, with nuances. So this notion that it's being done in a siloed fashion isn't bringing enough to bear, clearly, because we are where we are. Maybe there is another way to join forces, right? So the rising tides carry all ships. That's an interesting way to think about it. Jay, were you going to say something else?
I'd say that a lot of this discussion is leading to the biomarkers and the pharma piece of it. I think as you say that, again, if we have integrated diagnostics that clearly are linked to a therapeutic intervention, then not only I think that's a lot easier to carry downstream, but also to your point on the lobbying and the change management on Capitol Hill, it feels like there's a lot of alignment there between the pharma and diagnostics industries to really push together there. But a lot of my thought now is going toward and the other aligned environment is biomarkers and drug development space, where I think the tides have changed quite a bit. Every serious drug developer now knows that they have to have a biomarker and diagnostic strategy, and it's no longer like it was 10 years ago, like, maybe we'll do it, or we'll do it if we have to do it. They're investing heavily. And I think Mike Polini said earlier is like, the dynamics has changed too. They're viewing the diagnostics as strategic, not as a footnote or a vendor to serve my program. So I feel like that's a big vehicle for us, and we've got to figure out how to harness it.
I think another issue is that I feel like in diagnostics we're often playing checkers, and everyone else is playing chess, and we don't think about, I talked about this before, we don't think about the sort of business model that makes sense, that protects the industry as well. You have companies that have low gross margins, but still spending like drunken sailors in R&D. That just doesn't work. The lines don't cross. And so we have to think about how do we protect this sort of structural integrity of the diagnostics industry from a P&L point of view, and protect each other in terms of pricing and regulations and reimbursement. And I often think, like, we see companies come in thinking it's the tech space. it's not the tech space, it's not the consumer space. If it was, we still wouldn't have fax machines and pagers still being used. I mean, we fax still 30% of our test reports out, every day, and that's because this system resists innovation. It resists disruption. There's entrenched incumbents that all have a piece. They want to protect their pie. And so that's why we do have to stand together in a way. We may not agree on every single nuance, but it's those cracks that essentially prevent us from really rising above and not being the sort of ugly stepchild in healthcare.
The next thing on my notes, but I think we've kind of wandered into it, is reimbursement. The challenges with hundreds of payers. Information technology is not where we need it to be. I think you're touching on some of that here. Thoughts from anybody on how do we address that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the healthcare industry will always is going to be a late adopter of modern technologies, right? And it's that's just the way it is. But I guess just to put this into a bit of a framework, I would say diagnostic efforts in the future cannot be standalone diagnostics in their own CLIA lab with a single test that is being offered. I see two pathways, and one is tight integration with a therapeutic intervention and/or holistic solutions, which include consumer-centric models of delivering the service, the use of technology to move the data around in the right way, all of the surround sound services that would be that are above and beyond the physician. And by the way, physicians are now more open, I think, to working with genetic counselors, to working with pharmacists as an assist. So this whole conversation for me is coming back to, the question that we've been asked, which is, what is a diagnostic play of the future that's investable, right? And I think it's those two things. Those are the two pathways I see, together with how do we get it into these aligned environments and do implementation science to generate that evidence. And the last thing I'll say is, sometimes the Michael Shermans of the world would say, you've got a good diagnostic there, very interesting, but I don't know what's going to happen when I release this into the wild, right? So I think it's a different conversation if I say I have a integrated diagnostic and therapeutic solution. And so I know what I'm intending to affect on the therapeutic side. And I'm now going to test that I actually do that. And this is getting back into your field now, where we do have a tight link between the diagnostic and therapeutic. And we've struggled to do that. And we were talking about the implementation programs that we're trying to move forward here. But I do feel that makes a big difference in the conversation around payment. Is that clarity on the therapeutic intervention, where the diagnostics developers, we're not hands off on that. We're saying our solution directly links to therapy, be it a bona fide companion or not.
And I might make that more general.
Yeah.
To say decisional impact with an outcome that has value.
Right. But you can't just leave that open and say, well, we'll see what happens when we launch this.
Exactly.
I think you have to kind of control that and say that we know exactly what the intended downstream therapeutic intervention is, and hopefully we can show that during the development.
And I think that's where the investments, now have, when we do a companion diagnostic, we sort of have this really, really well-aligned component where they're both needed in order to get that drug over the finish line. These newer diagnostics that we're talking about with screening or with minimal residual disease, and these are incredibly exciting technologies, but they're more like Oncotype DX in the investments that are going to be needed by diagnostics companies in order to show their value, to show their clinical utility. And I think we have a longer road than with the companion diagnostic paradigm.
Yeah, I think the bright spot for me, though, is it's very hard to fight exponentials, Moore's law, these kinds of exponential scaling curves. One that I think we're all benefiting from is really the cost of biomarker detection. You think about genome sequencing has gone from $3 billion now to $100 per genome. Age of epigenome, looking at proteomics. The cost of having almost infinite analysis in a blood sample or a tissue specimen is going down to zero very rapidly. Whether it's 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, you're going to be able to get almost an infinite amount of information from a sample. And the big challenge, though, the big gap is going to be what do you make of all that information? And I think the fact that we're getting to closed loop sort of systems where we can use real-world evidence, real-world information to be able to make heads or tails of that, I think is going to shift the value proposition towards information and towards data, which has been the sort of rule of the land for every other field. But it's hard to fight those 10x, 100x, 1000x improvements that are going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years.
Just listening here, I'm thinking about if we go to, Mia just mentioned it, screening. So we've got there's a direct link, right? It's a diagnostic tied to a therapeutic, but then there's all of this other information coming at us that you could argue is going to be more of an indirect link, or it could be a direct link, but it's not maybe a direct link in the moment, right? You have a higher disposition, for X, and now more diagnostics happen. So we're going to have to figure out how do we fit those things in too, right? Because those are the real, I think, the
I'd
real
say
growth.
it's not as clean as a one-to-one mutation drug. But even there, for screening for cancer, right, with liquid biopsy, there is a downstream care pathway that one would recommend for a high-risk person. And there are guidelines that say what a high-risk person should do should they be identified. I know there's science to work out there, but even in those cases, we need to be, as developers, articulating the downstream clinical algorithms that you would follow. And it's definitely more complex than a single drug being given, but to me, even in that space, there is a downstream algorithm that would be recommended for a high-risk person identified.
Yeah,
I don't know. What do you think, oncologist?
He's calling on you, Mia.
I think you're developing in that space, and you have soon to have FDA-approved products. So I'll yield to you for a moment.
Yeah, okay, sure. So obviously we're bringing to market our first test, which is screening for colorectal cancer, and we finished a 25,000 patient trial and was successful. And we're very excited about this because, I think back to the implementation science, the thing that I was floored by when I first, came to Guardant was it wasn't necessarily the big breakthroughs that we needed. It was the fact that the basic stuff, the stuff that we would make sure our loved ones got, wasn't being administered in half the population. So there's a huge gap between 7%. What people should be doing and what people are actually doing in terms of guidelines versus practice. And if you just close that gap in terms of the existing sort of interventions and drugs, you would enormously improve outcomes. And this is a case for colorectal screening where right now 50,000 people per year die of colorectal cancer. Most, 65% of people are screened, but 50 million Americans aren't. And so 76% of those deaths come from those unscreened individuals. And so, just have so many individuals who aren't getting a colonoscopy or a stool test. And that's really where we believe a blood test is going to make a huge dent. When you do the analysis and you look at the fact that most blood tests have over a 90% compliance rate, this would be, if we were able to do that, probably the biggest reduction in cancer mortality in the last 20 years. So it's really exciting to see how this test may potentially change the landscape. And I think to Jay's point, we don't think of the test as a sort of isolated kind of piece of the puzzle. You have to think about how it perturbs the existing landscape of tests in terms of other screening methodologies, as well as what is the follow-on intervention that happens with a positive test or a negative test. And that's why with colorectal, I think it's exciting because you have a colonoscopy, which sort of ends the diagnostic odyssey for many of those patients. And so it absolutely makes sense from an outcomes point of view, as well as a health economics point of view from a population health perspective.
I want
Just
to
to
double
pick
down.
up-
You go first.
Okay, just to pick up on that theme, we look at MRD as more of a complementary diagnostic than a companion diagnostic that says it's not like a light switch where you're going to do X if you get a certain readout. It's more like a dial, meaning, so let me give you the case of a typical cancer patient with multiple myeloma, and I bumped into Kathy this morning, so I'll talk about the kind of the patient care continuum and what a clinician would do at each different point. Which post-induction, there's a trial right now called Determination that says if you're MRD negative, that you're going to have the same, that you won't benefit from a transplant. Okay, you get the same outcomes whether you're transplanted or not transplanted if your patient's MRD negative. And then post-transplant, you can look at depth of response, right, and then determine if you're whether you're going to go to consolidation therapy or maintenance therapy, right? And then from there, you would look at whether you consolidate further, or if you're on maintenance therapy, if you have 2 subsequent MRD negative tests, then you can go off of maintenance therapy. So throughout the patient's journey, you can test, and basically, at least in lymphoid cancer, we have a little bit of technology when we talk about solid tumors versus liquid tumors, but we're actually counting cancer cells. And so throughout a patient's journey, you get this information, and a clinician uses this information to make a decision on how to treat a patient at that time point within the cancer patient's journey. If you look at, Rafael Fonseca did a peer education board at Texas Oncology the other Monday night for us, and he said having MRD is, if you think about a pilot flying a plane, and MRD is the steering wheel or the yoke. All the other instruments are important, but you're actually counting how many cancer cells are left in a body. This is a driving factor. Now, when you go, and again, relating to payers, relating to kind of the regulatory environment, payers are exactly what do you do with information at this time point. You're developing the clinical evidence over time, but that takes time and all these different trials to do. Does that mean that you don't pay for a very, very important piece of information that can guide, a pilot landing the plane, or in this case, a clinician treating a patient the right way with the right treatment at the right time, based on their clinical knowledge and expertise? Of course you do. Of course you should. So.
I was thinking back on your comment earlier about if only everyone got the standard of care, right? And I was a Komen scholar several years ago, and Komen had this bold goal, they called it, to reduce breast cancer deaths by 50% in 10 years. And they thought that they could get half of the way there simply by helping women get the standard of care that already was there. And I think to the implementation science component that PMC was so pivotal in identifying that really we haven't succeeded in implementing precision cancer therapies for patients with lung cancer. And if we could put our effort and our focus into changing that paradigm, just like you're describing with yours, imagine the lives we could save, imagine the impact we could have, imagine the number of people who could live longer with quality of life.
You stole my whole thing there. That's exactly what
You're
I was
welcome.
But I love the analogy. I love your story on colorectal cancer because it makes it very, very clear. There's guidelines around and knowledge around colorectal cancer that say if you screen people and you get them in for colonoscopy, then you save lives. And there's a huge part of the population that's not doing that. And if you have a modality that says I can move that by 10 percentage points, the payoff is huge and direct line, and people will agree with you. And you're leveraging the science that we already know about. So I love that framework around implementation science. Let's implement at scale what we know works and what we know has a clinical and health economic benefit. And I will put in a bit of a plug for, I'm working with Daryl and the Personalized Medicine Coalition on their cancer implementation science program. And you may have seen this great paper that, I don't know if it's great, but it was a great paper, but the message in it was that what we know to be effective in cancer precision medicine is not implemented at scale and 35% penetrated. So that is something we'll be working on collaboratively, looking for folks here in the audience and in the PMC to get involved. And we were even brainstorming at lunch, how do we do something really meaningful in cancer implementation science.
Yeah.
So I just put that plug in for that program.
I love it, and I want to just say that, back to where we started, this is not the conversation we would have been having 15 years ago. So, I really think we have come a long way, and there is so much brightness ahead in the future. We're running out of time, and I apologize. I was watching for questions. I didn't see many, but I could do this for 30 more minutes up here. I think I'll just close by, again, thanking everybody for being here, because we're all in this together. And we are continuing to innovate, and we are continuing to overcome a lot of these challenges. And I am not going to stop without mentioning that I just noticed that Chad's shoes say "pay" on them. And I don't know if that was planned, but maybe that's what you wear when you get.
Let's say it is.
Okay, all right, I like it. So that's our thing, pay. Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, it's Mary Beth. How are you? Nice.
As we transition to the next session, I want to thank Kim for the last comment where she said, we're all in this together, which is the theme of the Personalized Medicine Coalition. We're going to move seamlessly, I hope, from a discussion of diagnostics to a conversation about precision medicine in the pharmaceutical industry. And our panel discussion is going to be led by Randy Burkhalter, who's Vice President for Policy at Pharma in Washington, D.C. And an unknown fact about Randy is that he was one of the founders of the Personalized Medicine Coalition back in 2003. I'd like to believe it's because he was so foresighted to see that precision medicine was going to take over the pharmaceutical industry in these past 20 years. So as they get mic'd up, I'm going to ask Randy to welcome his distinguished panel from across the industry. So I'll give him a couple more seconds. Good to go? Almost, okay. All right. I'm sorry? Oh, no, get Mike, yeah.
Thanks all for your patience, and thank you all for being here. It's great to be able to be here with all of you this afternoon. Been a great conference so far, and it's especially great for me to be able to be on the stage with four of the leaders from the biopharmaceutical research space who are playing a really important role in moving the field of personalized medicine forward. Since Ed already outed me as someone who's been around a little while at the Personalized Medicine Coalition, I was thinking back to that when Raju was talking earlier in the day about some of those early formative meetings. And one thing I thought about, well, a couple of things I thought. One was that it was because of the leadership and commitment of people like Raju that the Personalized Medicine Coalition is where it is today, but more importantly, that the field of personalized medicine is where it is today. So thank you, Dr. Kushar-Lapati, for your leadership role especially. And since I think Mike is still in the audience too, Mike, I'm just going to say publicly, I like you, man. I know payers have a tough role, so we respect that. But, and thank you for your leadership as well. You know, if payers in the U.S. had more leaders like Mike, I'm convinced that healthcare would be better in the U.S. So I mean it, Mike. With that, I did, you know, the other thing that occurred to me when Raju was talking was the degree of skepticism that was there 15 or 20 years ago about whether the biopharmaceutical research sector really was committed to personalized medicine. Would we evolve our business model and go where the science really looked like it was leading? And so because we are where we are today, I think we can answer that clearly, affirmatively, but it's especially gratifying for me to be able to be on stage with 4 leaders again from the biopharmaceutical research space who are helping to lead that transformation. So we have a really great panel. We have, I think, 45 minutes. We're going to leave some time for Q&A from the audience at the end. So as we're talking, do be thinking about your interesting and provocative questions, and don't be shy about coming on up to the mics at the end when we open it up for audience Q&A. So with that, I want to just ask each of the panelists to go down and take just 2-3 minutes to say who you are, what your role is in your company, and most importantly, why does that role really matter for patients and consumers out there right now? What gets you up in the morning? So, Stefan, let's start with you.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Stefan Ho. I head translational oncology and oncology diagnostics at Pfizer. And what that means is what we focus on in the role that I support is to ensure that as we move drugs from discovery into first-in-human, on into registrational studies, and ultimately into the clinic, we want to make certain that we're bringing to bear a deep and current and competitive understanding of the science as we develop that clinical development effort. So that's really the focus that we have from a translational oncology point of view. And to that end, what gets me out of bed every morning really gets to what I think all of us are communicating the same sort of perspective. And at Pfizer, what we kind of refer to as just breakthroughs that change patients' lives. That's really what we're trying to accomplish every day, getting out of bed, struggling through all the challenges that we're focused on. It's really coming back to the patients. And to that end, one additional perspective for me personally is that I'm a pathologist by training. I think we had other pathologists here as well. And for me, what's really incredible is that in my training, we were focused on interpreting the morphology of the disease process to make a diagnosis. Now we're able to go beyond the light microscope to have a thorough and deep molecular characterization of that disease process. And the critical challenge that gives rise to is how do we use that information and bring it to bear to enhance and accelerate and de-risk the drug development process. So that's really a focus of what we're addressing at Pfizer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sarah Hersey. I work for Bristol Myers Squibb. I lead our Translational Sciences and Diagnostic organization. We have a responsibility for supporting the various therapeutic areas from oncology to immunology to cardiovascular. I won't repeat Stefan, but we have very similar job roles, just at different organizations. I think what gets me up in the morning every day is, quite frankly, those patient testimonials and just hearing about the patients. So I think we saw, Peter's video today, which was amazing. Bonnie's contributions, which were amazing. And I think it's these positive stories of success, of, beating the odds, of improving the disease, of being able to walk again in the context of Peter's, that gets me inspired. And in the same vein, I think every moment is so precious. And that, patients are quite frankly waiting. I had just last week very sad news come across my desk a 4-year-old girl named Lila had succumbed. She had lost her battle with cancer. And it's a constant reminder that every time I see these positive patient videos of all this wonderful hope and how much impact we've had, I recognize there's so much more to do. Quite frankly, we've only just begun the journey, and that's literally what gets me up every single morning.
And good afternoon, Gabriele Allegri. I'm Global Commercial Head for Precision Medicine for Johnson & Johnson, Innovative Medicine. I went very slowly with making sure that my accent is. So any Global Commercial Head, so a little bit of difference here. So first of all, yes, global, so my responsibility is for the entire globe, so for all the major countries in which we do operate, and commercially focused. What does it mean? What is considered the finish line, so that is the regulatory approval, for me and for the team is the starting line. So because we want to make sure that all the drug that we develop eventually can reach all the patients all around the globe. So what make me awake every morning or keep me not sleeping in the night is access to patients all around the globe. I think I moved here 2 years ago from Europe. I moved to probably the wrong side of US. This is what's right, so I'm the east part of. But exactly, I know it's a sensitive topic here, but yeah, I can say. And when 2 years ago I asked my daughter, 9 years old, okay, we have this opportunity, let's go there. She asked me a similar question, say, what are we going to do there? And I explained, okay, precision medicine and what else. What does really mean in practice? And I think I go back to the 2 videos that we showed this morning. This is exactly why we are here, to make sure that the fantastic technology, innovative drug that every single company here is developing eventually reach to the right patients. Easy to say, I think it's a long journey here, and I'm here to learn everything we have done and PNC has done in the last 20 years, but more importantly to make sure that we accelerate this path, because 25% are the drugs that have been approved by FDA that are precision medicine enabled, but more importantly in the development there are 60% or even more drugs that are biomarker enabled.
And hello, I'm Christina Hochul, so I'm at Alexion, AstraZeneca's Rare Disease Business Unit, and I lead our Strategic Alliance Development function. So I work closely and lead the work with our third-party groups. So I work with patient advocacy organizations, coalitions, trade associations to advance public policy goals, so located in Washington, D.C. I think what gets me up in the morning is just, I was a rare disease patient. I had a rare disease when I was a child, and I think about my own diagnostic journey and how long it took me to get diagnosed, and then I was fortunate to have access and get a therapy for my condition. And I think about the unmet need in our community, and that of these rare diseases, more than 90% do not have an FDA-approved therapy. So, and 50% of people with rare disease are children. So every day when I get up, I think of all the families out there, and especially the children out there that are just waiting for companies like these to invest and invent a therapy.
Thanks. Thank you all. That's great. And I really appreciate the references to the patient impact. I think, Sarah, one of the things we'll all walk out of here with is remembering the video of the patient who got out of the wheelchair. That does remind us all why we're here every day in the story that we really are a part of. But it's also really important to remember how many of the patients are still waiting and how many fight with unmet needs. So, Gabrielle, I wanted to pick up quick on one thing you said. And ask you to build on it a little, but if others have thoughts as well, would welcome it, which was the importance of your work to translate not only science into clinical trials, but translate advances into actual better clinical practice, better patient care. So if there's, looking at the U.S. system, I know this is a fraught question, but if there's like maybe one or two things you could say, these one or two things could really make a difference in that last step of translation to make sure that these advances are actually getting to patients. And I'm asking because we heard earlier, there is the kind of research being done by PMC is illustrating we have work to do there. What do we do? What should PMC be doing to start to make a difference there?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a great question. There is a lot of lesson learned that I think we need to start with, because as I'm representing here, J&J is a giant. It's a 130 years old company, but it's somehow a startup company in the precision medicine environment. So key question I usually receive, okay, perfect, what can we do to make sure that we close the gap there, to make sure that every patient get the right treatment? And the publication for me is a fantastic eye-opener. I mean, despite all the huge investment that has been done in the past and huge effort from different angles, despite all of that, still only 36% of the patients get the right treatment. So I think there is not an easy answer here to your questions. To your question, I think probably the most important one for me is PMC and the concept of partnership. There are a lot of individual type of effort, single company, that are going to try to fix the problem there. But what is really impactful? This is the business, the question I have. Operating in a precision medicine, personalized medicine environment is very different from a traditional pharma sector or drug. Why? You have a patient identification. You need to make sure that the proper patient identification is made as part of the equation of the value. We need to break a lot of silos between pharma companies, between pharma and diagnostic, and making sure that we have a unified approach. So I think there is more discussion to go. Is one of our objectives as a board at the PMC to understand what are the key priorities there. But I would say coordination and partnership is a key element of the answer.
Great, thanks. Anyone else have anything to add on that?
I think for me, we've heard it throughout the whole day. Our healthcare system is exquisitely complex. So I think one of the key things we have to think about is where are there opportunities to, quite frankly, simplify and streamline, to make things easier for patients, easier for physicians, easier for everyone. I think the other thing that was brought up is just the value proposition of diagnostics. I think for many, many years, they've been grossly undervalued. You know, they make, 70+% of our medical decisions, yet they account for a very small fraction of our total healthcare costs. And I think until we rectify that as well, it's going to make things challenging. So for me, it's simplify, standardize, streamline, and make sure that we're getting adequate, payment for that carrot, or the carrot's being dangled, as I think Mike mentioned earlier, appropriately.
And I guess one comment I would make is that all of us who are involved in drug development are completely dependent on people outside our companies. Number one, we're completely dependent on the patients and the patients' physicians to actually enroll these clinical trials. We're completely dependent on the diagnostic companies and platform technology companies to bring forward cutting-edge technology that we can then try to use to advance and accelerate drug development. So part of it for me is it's really just an incredible partnership amongst a lot of different parties that certainly we rely on, and we view it as partnerships in order for us to move things forward. As we try to bring forward precision medicines, in other words, a medicine that's linked to a diagnostic test that allows us to bring the greatest benefit to the right patients, it's really about the biology. The core challenge of this whole effort, in my view, in oncology at least, and I think it applies to all disease states, is the biology of the disease is highly heterogeneous, especially in oncology. We know that. We've heard the comments of cancer being a number of different small, rarer diseases. And that intrinsically creates this challenge in terms of taking a drug that has a specific mechanism, specific target, trying to understand the complexity of the biology, overlaying a test that helps us capture that complexity and matching those. So I think when I look at precision medicine, I think of it in three levels. Number one is where the drug target and the test are actually linked. The test is analyzing actually the target of the drug. For example, BRAF or EGFR. That's what the drug is targeting. We're looking for mutation in those. So that's level one. And a lot of great examples that have really been incredible, huge successes. Level two is where we move one step away. We're no longer trying to capture the relevant biology with the target of the drug. We're saying, okay, there are other things that aren't the drug target that we feel identify the right patients. The challenge there with the complexity and system network of the biology is by moving one step away from that drug target you're increasing the challenge of truly being able to identify that right patient population. And we've had successes there as well. Gene panels that are targeting a pathway, actually the recent approval of capivasertib in the PIK3CA pathway, identifying multiple mutations within the pathway to bring forward an AKT inhibitor. So that's level 2, and we've proven that. Other examples of level 2 is KRAS. KRAS with an EGFR antibody. They're not, the target is not, the diagnostic target is not the drug target, but again, it's the biology that's linking those two. We know that KRAS mutation basically bypasses the regulatory circuits that link a receptor on the surface of the cell to the cell cycle. So there's a biologic rationale why we're able to move one step beyond the target. And there's other examples, TMB, tumor mutation burden, linking that to the mechanism of the immune system. But where the challenge is in what I'll call level 3, where we do not have proof of concept, and as we look forward 10 years in the future to precision medicine, I think that's where the big challenge lies from my perspective. Going beyond, I guess I'll call it the more straightforward biologies, dominant driver oncogenes, and moving into the more complex biologies. I don't know what the current statistic is, but precision medicines in oncology have benefited, 25% of patients, but there's a big bulk of patients who as yet have not benefited from precision medicine. And so for me, a big challenge where we're going to rely on our new novel platform technologies, novel data systems, multimodal data analysis, trying to bring together all these disparate areas of information to try to achieve that proof of concept in what I'll call level 3, or the next generation of precision medicine. So there I'm really excited and recognizing that we as a pharma sponsor are completely dependent on all the innovation in the diagnostics space to help move that forward and achieve the next big breakthroughs to try to expand precision medicine beyond what we're currently, where we've been successful so far.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to shift quick to Washington with apologies, but like partnership and collaboration aren't usually the thing that is happening in Washington around healthcare debate, number one. And number two, the healthcare debate isn't usually at the level of getting the healthcare delivery system and healthcare financing and incentives aligned around the kind of value proposition from the sophisticated science that you all are talking about, running from increasingly complex diagnostics down to getting the right, how does that translate to getting the right drug to the right patient at the right time? So, long way of saying, if there's one thing, and maybe Christine, I'll start with you, but if there's one thing that you could say to policymakers in Washington, or if you want to say the state house, but especially in Washington, to help break through there and help align the healthcare system better to that value proposition, what's the one thing you'd say to them?
Well, I mean, I think both personally and professionally, I spend a lot of time talking to politicians, and I think it's just honestly just making it personal and just really showing your passion and just trying to get on their level and explain it to them, I think is how you have the best course. I mean, you have to appeal to a lot of different audiences, and that can be very challenging. And it makes for a lot of excitement, a lot of heated dinner table conversations we have, trying to explain the healthcare system to my mother-in-law or something of that sort. It's been, but yeah, I think it's just keeping it personal and bringing the human and patient element to it. Like, there's been a lot of discussion on patients in here, but those aren't the best advocates, right? Like, members want to hear from their patients. They want to, and so really what we've tried to do at Alexion is really working closely with the patient community and in collaboration with them on public policy issues.
Absolutely, the place we need to start. Anything to add?
Yeah, probably. Let's start also from us, what we can do different, and I think it's a matter of language, and it's not accent here, but it's a language. Are we all using the same language here when we go and talk to them? Because every single company have a different angles, and if you move from pharma to diagnostic, it's even different. So I think we need to be more consistent and impactful when it comes to language and the message we deliver to them. And we need to simplify a lot the science and bring it to the impact of patients. Patient need to be the center of the concept there. So I think it is an effort that all of us need to do when we go down in Washington. And if there is a concept I would like to bring to them is, and I'm bringing my global perspective, is that everything that we do here in the US has a huge impact in all patients that are sitting here in the US. But probably you don't realize it, but there is a huge impact also outside of US. I was in Japan 1 month ago, talking with the authority there. One of the user question is, okay, but what's happening in the US? How they're treating, how they're regulating, what is the regulation there? So here's an example. Usually US is the first country that is setting the stage. So responsibility that politician has in Washington is for US citizens, but is much broader.
Thanks. Sarah, did you have something to
I think I was just going to add, I agree with personalizing it, I think, but also putting facts behind it. So I think there was a study in Taiwan that showed with stage 4 lung cancer patients, after 5 years of all the personalized medicine being deployed, they saw a doubling in the survival rate. That is not insignificant. And then I would take with me some patients who had benefited in that context and share their stories, and then ask the question, how can that not be valued? How is that not value add? And really try to tie the personal aspect to, real tangible information that is real, and link the two together. I think, again, the simplification piece, I'm going to bring it up again. I think from a policy perspective, anything we can do to try to also work globally, not just in the US, but one of the challenges we face into regularly is that we're trying to get our drugs and our therapeutics to everybody across the globe. And one of the challenges is there is not a lot of harmonization in regulatory and policy. It makes it very challenging. You've got the US and the EU, every country almost is independent in the context of the diagnostic. Anything we can do to simplify is going to help us get those treatments to patients more effectively, as well as testing. So.
Awesome. And I guess the only thing I would add, I think it's organizations like PMC that are absolutely critical to facilitate and bring that narrative. In other words, it's much more powerful if we're collaborating, coming together as diverse, multiple stakeholders in one unbiased group that's bringing folks together, and then approach other stakeholders like governmental stakeholders or others. So I think that's a critical piece.
I think that really is reinforcing a lot of what we've heard throughout the day, and I'm sure Ed's heard it as well, but so clearly such an important role for PMC to be playing there and making the science simple and connecting the science to the ultimate impact on patients and consumers at the end of the day. So thanks for that. I'm gonna maybe build on that and ask you one more question, and then maybe we'll open it up to the audience after that. But I think it's I think it's hard to break through sometimes on the policy agenda, and it really takes that kind of making it personal to really break through. And it's maybe sometimes too easy to let yourself risk getting discouraged when you're in Washington, that it's going to take too long. So I think one of the things that struck me about the conference so far is all the reason for optimism on the supply side, on the science side of this. So I'd say if we leave the audience with nothing else, leave us with some reason for real optimism about how it is that, setting aside what does or doesn't happen in Washington or at the state, let's hope we fix a few things and get a few incentives straightened out in regards to accelerating and not decelerating progress. But that aside, what is it from the science side that can really drive transformation in healthcare and in clinical adoption and in better, because we do see it happen sometimes. So what do you hope to happen over the next 5 or 10 years in personalized medicine that could flip that switch for us in healthcare?
Yeah, for me, the science piece is that everything is driven by technology. Advances in science are driven by advances in technology. Great discoveries always come on the heels of some advance in technology that allow us to learn more, to understand more about the systems we're studying. So what excites me is again, the incredible advances in technology, ranging all the way from digital spatial profiling to the incredible kind of information we're able to extract from 10 mils of blood. It's just incredible. So, but for me, so a lot of optimism there, but also a little bit daunted by the challenges, because the challenge is, how do you use this technology? It provides a lot of opportunities, but what we're focused on is as we move a drug through the clinic from early into late development, it's really about what is the question we're seeking to ask. And the questions differ at that early phase where you don't know you have a drug and you're trying to generate data that helps you determine, do you still have the possibility of a drug that truly can ultimately impact patients, to later stages where you need to understand and demonstrate the benefit risk and actually demonstrate that benefit in the population that you're interested in. So for me, the challenge is with all the great technologies that are coming forward at varying degrees of validation, I'll say technical validation, much less clinical validity or clinical utility, when's the right point in time to commit the investment to apply that into this drug development process? So I'm very optimistic. I'm a little daunted because that's a continuous challenge for us to understand the technology, and let's not even start talking about AI. That's a whole other space that we're very, very focused on, trying to understand how to apply it.
That was my last question, but we'll let the audience ask that question.
But yeah, so very excited, but daunted as well, I guess.
Yeah, I would concur. I think that the technology is super, super exciting from an innovation perspective. Our ability to interrogate biology now is like it's never been. I've been in the industry almost 30 years, and just the crazy amount of advancement we've made in the last 10 years, I never thought I would see it, to be honest. We would just make incremental changes, and to Stefan's point, it's truly amazing. I think one of the challenging things, and I think about some of the biomarkers we have at BMS, is many of them are enrichment, and we see that individuals that don't have that biomarker still respond. And as you seek to understand more, I think, what I would say is science is hard. Any tools we can have, AI I think is going to be invaluable as we move forward to the next 10 years. Machine learning, the ability to take complex data sets and integrate them and interrogate them, those tools are going to be imperative to us to advance the science. And I think to not, keep going on what Stefan had said, I think the area I'm excited about is seeing precision medicine expand beyond oncology. So I think that there's areas like immunology that quite frankly are very ripe. Very similar in the context of oncology, that these are often very heterogeneous diseases. If you think about lupus and think about the lack of real success we've had in that space over the last, how many phase 3 trials, I think one of the reasons is just we've recognized, it's a very heterogeneous disease. It's very difficult. And we're working, at BMS and some projects in cardiovascular, in neuroscience, in hematology, in immunology. I couldn't be more excited, to be honest with you, to see precision medicine, expand. And what I'm hoping is we learn from all of our experiences in oncology to just accelerate, put our basically foot on the gas and go, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Yep. Gabrielle?
I agree. It's a fantastic moment. There is a lot of technology, a lot of innovation happening everywhere. Let me add also neuroscience is another fast-growing area where precision medicine, personalized medicine approach can really make the difference. What I'm optimistic on, I know there is a lot of discussion regarding framework, reimbursement, policy. There is a lot of challenges there. What I'm very optimistic on is thinking about looking back at and look at the number of patients that have been able to access precision medicine-enabled drugs compared to 10 years ago and what we have nowadays. And if you look prospectively in the next year, it's going to be an exponential growth. Why I'm optimistic? Because I believe that with this expansion, probably we will able also to optimize a lot of stuff, and the cost, so the accessibility of those technology will be more approachable in the country, but also outside in the country, in other countries. So it will be lower cost, better accessibility. And if it's not only oncology, but also other therapeutic areas, even more, we'll have the opportunity there to really make the difference.
Thank you. Kristen, do you have anything to add, or shall we turn it to the...
Yeah, I think I'm just excited just because we know so many of the rare diseases are genetic in nature, and just the future of the genetic testing in the rare disease space. So we've seen next generation sequencing and all of those different technologies that are becoming more affordable and used on, on patients to diagnose them quicker is really exciting, and I can't wait to see what happens.
All right, that's fantastic. Thank you all so much, and you've given me about 6 or 8 more questions, but we promised we'd open it up to the audience. So if anyone wants to make your way down to the microphones, please do. As you're thinking about questions in the meantime, I will ask you one more then, and maybe Christine, I will start with you, which is, I think it's always struck me that, I'll bite my tongue. I don't know how long this question's going to go. I'll try to make it really, really quick, and Christina will answer in 3 minutes, but personalized medicine is about the targeting of treatments to a lot of times small or smaller patient subgroups. And sometimes that happens at the time of initial FDA approval with an orphan or rare disease, but a lot of times it also happens a number of years after initial FDA. In fact, that seems to almost be an intrinsic element of making progress in personalized medicine. If you look at like Xalkori, Herceptin, the BTK1 inhibitors, there's probably a lot of other examples where 6, 7, 8, 9 years after the initial approval, we see significant advances in better understanding how to target the drug based on new diagnostic information. So I'm obviously asking this question in a way that's very leading, because I'm really worried about, especially listening to Scott Gottlieb this morning talk about the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on R&D. It got me thinking about whether that's one area where the IRA, in particular the drug pricing provisions, really risk devaluing the nature of progress because it wasn't really paying close enough attention to how that progress happens. So if you have views on that from a how progress happens or a public policy side, would welcome it.
No, I would agree with you, Randy. I mean, I think we are very concerned that the Inflation Reduction Act has slowed and even some cases stopped drug development, especially in the rare disease space. And we know that a lot of these rare diseases, small patient populations, genetic in nature, somewhat linked diseases, and we know that a product may get approved for one indication, and then as we further study it, it becomes approved for multiple indications. And that, going back to my beginning point, we have a ton of unmet need in the community, and so, we want to protect and foster that innovation so we can really close the gap for a patient to continue to have access and continue to get therapies out there. So it does worry me at night as well.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think one of the challenges is we often start off, as you mentioned, in smaller populations, right? And then expand and add additional indications over time. And I think one of the challenges of this is it's really starting to cause us to have to rethink how we do development. Do we go after larger populations first because the clock starts, essentially, right? Do we not do certain programs because of the timing duration? Like, we recently made a very difficult decision on one of our assets not to pursue in frontline multiple myeloma because we were looking into a 10-year trial horizon. And so it is, causing us to rethink how we approach things and rethink innovation. And I think one of our examples, and I'm sure Stefan has numerous as well, is with Opdivo and Yervoy. Post that initial launch, we now have 28 indications in 11 different tissue types. You think about that, and I will say we also have numerous trials still ongoing in the process, and that would be a real shame to see things like that no longer happen or happen at a reduced level.
For sure. And before I run down the hall pulling my hair out because of this, I'm going to turn to the microphone if that's okay. Forgive me, but yeah, let's get a question from the audience. I think we need the mic on or louder. I want to make sure the audience catches the question because I'm not. Or just speak up and I'll repeat the question. That's okay. That's okay. Just go ahead.
Thank you. Aubrey Kelly with Rappel Health. I first want to share a personal story. So my brother was just diagnosed with grade 4 glioblastoma. He got his Caris Labs in yesterday, and we're talking about his treatment. And so I think, from a personal perspective, this is a prime example of how the panel before you and the current panel, nonprofit, for-profit organizations need to work together on an individual level to ensure that patients are equipped with the best hope going forward. So first off, thank you for everything that you do, and for the panelists, if you're in the room for the last panel, thank you. My question is, we heard from the last panel that P&L is really important for diagnostic companies. It's really a tough business model right now. And what good looks like in terms of giving patients hope is being able to work together and ensure that we are, yes, using all of the AI tools from a development perspective, but also using all of the tools that we have and the partnerships that we have through implementation science, through maybe, rethinking traditional commercial marketing tactics to actually ensure that we have the evidence that we are helping more patients either get to standard of care, get on clinical trials, and actually give hope. So my question to you is, do you see this as an opportunity to start to rethink where you're actually kind of placing your bets in traditional recruitment or traditional commercial spend efforts, to actually think more about it in the context of alliances and really taking, because the technology is there now, to really take an evidence-based approach to create hope for more patients? So yes, there's the global aspect, but there's also the very individualized aspect that I think is really important. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, for sharing, and for the question. So I think it was around where should we really be focusing our efforts on partnership to really take this to the next level, really drive it forwards. Anyone want to take that one?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think all of us in the room today is a great example, right? What the PMC does. I would say, in the last 10 years, I have great hope because, 10 years ago, if we said we were going to do a pre-competitive collaboration, for example, with Pfizer and Novartis and J&J, there would have been substantial pushback. Potentially, it would have been like, well, how could we pre-collaborate on a diagnostic or a test with our fierce competitors? And now I will say it's something that we all are embracing. I currently, participate in a number of pre-competitive consortia where you have 4, 5, 6 pharmaceutical companies, and we're sharing, we're, pooling our money, we're pooling our data. I think one of the greatest things that we're doing now, and 10 years ago, while I've always wanted this to happen, I never thought it would necessarily always come true. We have consortia with measurable residual disease, for example, where we have a third party, and pharma is giving our data to that third party so that they can do meta-analysis to try to drive the science much quicker and faster than we could individually on our alone for our patients. Basically trying to look at, can you get MRD as a surrogate for overall survival? And so I'm hopeful. I think we need to do more of that. I think to Gabrielle's point earlier, we collectively need to come together. We need to speak with one voice. We need to drive together because that's how we're going to get the ability to really accelerate and make a bigger impact.
Let me build on that. I think it's not a nice to have or to do. I think it's a mandatory, it's a must. There is a publication from Gary Pisano, that is professor of Harvard Business School, that's talking about innovation, all different type of innovation, but specifically calling out personalized medicines as an architectural type of innovation. What does it mean? You need new capabilities to compete in there, and it's obvious you need to understand biomarker, something that in traditional pharma launch you don't. But the other component is new business model. So back to your point of PNL, we need as a pharma company to come together, collaborate earlier, and also making sure that we simplify the road also for the diagnostic company. How much money are they spending in overreaching the complexity of bringing a diagnostic into the market? I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and it's a must do the alliance and collaborate together. I think the new entry also at the board of PMC is a strong signal to your question that there are more stakeholders that are looking at collaborating together. I think it's the reality, the dream that we had probably some years ago is coming together, and we are working together.
That's great. Any other questions? It looks like not. Chris, how are we doing on time? We have time for one more question. All right, I'm gonna go back to the AI question then, but only because, and I think as we heard from an earlier panel, it comes up. It's kind of the hot thing in Washington, or a hot thing in Washington, but everyone's trying to figure out what actually is behind those letters. So I guess I'd ask it this way, like from the vantage point of how you do your work, how do you see machine learning or AI changing it, setting aside the rest of healthcare because that's a big hot mess on AI, but how is it changing your work, or how do you hope that it will change your work over the next couple of years for the better?
Yeah, AI, I mean, two things. I think it's important to be clear on what exactly it is that anyone is meaning when they say AI, because it's all sorts of different types of machine learning. So that's number one. And then the number two is it depends, what is this very specific application? Because there have been incredible benefits, particularly in digital imaging analysis, in terms of actually AI algorithms and models that truly are providing great benefit. But from where I sit in terms of biomarker analyses, biologic information, trying to build that into drug development, de-risk drug development. Ideally, the holy grail is drug response prediction. Can we somehow take all this data and then predict, what drug will win and which patients will win? So that's the holy grail. But I think the challenge is, one big challenge is the data, and this is a big one. Just the amount of data needed to generate the kinds of true AI types of models that I think people think about when they think about AI is just enormous. Way incredibly more than any sort of large clinical trial, which is 800 patients or something along those lines. Not millions and billions. So in terms of drug response, we will never have that endpoint to train the model. So there'll have to be alternative approaches. So I think my perspective is we really need to define the application, and actually for a lot of us, I think it's making sure we continue to monitor for any given application how the field is progresses, because it's moving so rapidly that it's changing on a moment's notice.
Any last word on AI or anything else before we wrap up? If not, I'm leaving the panel more optimistic about the future than I started. So thank you all very much, and let's give our panel. Thank you.